Looking at this grassroots area, it is enormous, and for the time that we have today, we realistically can't do it justice because there's so many things involved in it. So we're going to have to restrict our scope a little bit more. And in order to do that, I have a hypothesis that I want to put in front of you, which is ultimately that infrastructure is where the value is at. It's not just based upon viewing figures. And this sits upon the idea that we are very much in strong growth at this moment in time. In fact, I actually think in grassroots in particular, we haven't even started to hit strong growth yet whatsoever. In terms of the community itself, the format is still in flux. It's not immediately clear where the community is going to reside in the next 5 years or so. Equally, it's still very much in early development stages, so it could change very, very quickly. And this has profound implications and potential impacts for those who are looking to invest, but also those who are already invested in groups like pro teams. And we're going to split it down by looking at those who would be looking to invest in the grassroots or potentially be considering it, and also those who are already in those larger organizations. Now, in order to look at this and to try and form a semblance of what it is that could be seen as an opportunity, we're going to have to look at China and South Korea. And we're going to start with that and come back to the West as part of it all. And the next graph I'm about to give you is a bit busy, so just bear with me whilst I go through it, and you'll see what I'm trying to get at. So what I've decided to do, and what we've done as part of this study, is understand what does a mature market potentially look like? What is the size of the prize? Why are we going for this? Is it worthwhile bothering with the grassroots? Well, actually, it potentially is. And the reason why is because if we look at the community and the size of it, it is potentially enormous. So what I've done here is I have used the average revenue per screen by country, a cinema screen I mean, and extrapolated that over the bricks and mortar locations in China and South Korea. There are 160,000 internet cafes in China. There are 20,000 PC bangs in South Korea. I've also put in the US and the UK in there just to give a point of context and reference, and also to demonstrate that we haven't just put US figures into a Chinese market. So there are obviously a number of caveats about this before we start saying that you're going to make revenue of 23.6 billion a year out of the Chinese market. This is not what's happening now. In fact, even a fraction of it is probably unlikely to be had, but this is the potential that it could be. And the reason why is because you're getting both ticketing revenue from these particular groups, or just people being able to use the computers, formats, etc. You have retail revenue, people buying beers, for instance, or having like food with that particular piece. And there's physical merchandise you can sell. And on top of that, you have the sponsorship and advertising piece that you will also see in cinemas. Now, the obvious caveats to this are the following. It's, we are looking at something which is based upon a cinema model. Maybe cinema is not a good model to look at this on, and that might be the case, but ultimately cinema is very cheap. It shows a remarkable amount of similar characteristics in terms of what people are doing. They're going to sit on a screen and look at it for a few hours. And the type of things that they do, such as buy food and drink, is also quite likely to happen as well. Also, obviously not all internet cafes or PC bangs are eSports centres, but a hell of a lot of them are. And you'd have to say that the culture that you see around China and Korea is to a certain extent based upon this physical infrastructure that they're starting to develop. Equally, what you have in China has been a reduction in internet cafes into the last couple of years, which they've started to spike and increase. And the reason why they spike and increase is because of eSports. And the third thing is that some of this may already be accounted for, this potential revenue, in other ways. But the reality is that you have a market in specifically China, which of those 160,000 internet cafes, 0.2% of them are part of a chain or part of a franchise. So there's a hell of a lot of opportunity here to start aligning this, starting to harness some of the effect of it. And this ultimately is, if we put the projected value aside for 1 second, if we actually look at the number of physical locations in there, this flies in the face a little bit of what some people have been saying about esports being a digital phenomenon only. The reality is the center of gravity around esports is based on China and to a certain extent South Korea. And it may well be because they just have so many physical locations, something that just isn't replicated in the West at this moment in time. We're starting to see growth in physical locations, but the reality is that, that in something which has the building blocks and hasn't even got alignment yet, you have a very, 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 very strong esports culture. This hasn't necessarily been pushed or organized, it's just organically come that way. So I think that with this, we're in a position whereby there's enormous potential, but unlocking that potential requires a fair bit of investment, and we also need to understand the size of the gap that we're dealing with. And if we start to look at the size of that gap, we need to actually look at established infrastructures that we have in the West and start to look at how that compares to where esports is at this moment in time. Now, I've used the FA as a comparator, and I'm going to use it as a case study to model against the American market or potential American market in esports. So in the FA, you have 11 million people who play football in England. That is the base market. So that is at full rate potential of where you could be. Of them, 1.4 million of them are involved in the FA's remit, i.e. clubs, leagues, school games, whatever the case may be. That is what you're dealing with. That is represented in 90,000 teams, 22,000 clubs, and over 900 leagues. Now, to keep this going, and I'm not talking about revenue, just to keep this going, there's £180 million a year going into the running of just this grassroots football. There's a reason why sponsors pay a lot of money towards football. It's not just because of viewing figures, it's because of all that. There's so many touch points here. It's not just little Johnny going off and playing on Saturday, it's the fact that his parents go down there and his siblings might be involved in it. And then his friends might hear about the whole particular piece. That infrastructure is extraordinarily valuable because you have a loyalty piece and it funnels up the system. Now, if we start looking at the esports area, it's a little bit different. So let's start by looking at where the gap is and what the size of that potential gap is. So 164 million Americans play video games. This is not the base market that we're looking for. And this is a common mistake that's made of why you end up with enormous extrapolations around like the viewership of esports or its potential. Because the reality is half of them are only playing on mobile. Now, mobile may turn into an esports phenomenon, but that's not yet, and it's not guaranteed. So we realistically need to start cutting these figures down. Only 85 million of them are playing on PCs and consoles on the formats that actually require us to be able to access them. Of them, only 51 to 54 million of them are actually playing with other people. There's 30 million of them who are just playing the computer and will never go beyond that. Of them, you have 40 million people who are ultimately playing something other than games with words or some other stuff which, like, Jesus, it would never become a fucking e-sport. I'd probably watch paint dry before I'd watch anything like that. And then on top of that, when you rattle it down again, how many of them are playing for more than 2 hours a week? Well, 27 million. Now, that is your base market. That is your starting point in the American market at this moment in time. And that is where, and it's still a phenomenally large number of people. But ultimately, that is where we need to start our analysis from. Now, of that, based upon the FA's structure, 12.7% of them, or thereabouts, okay, play for a local club, team, whatever the case may be. Thus, in a mature market, you'd have a touch point with 3.5 million Americans who'd be involved in that. That would represent 54,600 clubs, stroke entities, over 2,000 leagues, and $500 million worth of investment just to keep the thing going. Now, that is an enormous bloody gap to where we are right now. And that is something which is there's an enormous amount of opportunity for anyone who can start to build some of that and own that. Because of that, it's not realistically going to come from the publishers. The publishers don't have the money to do this. And to a certain extent, their priorities may lay elsewhere as well. So this is going to come from private entities for those who are going to actually start building this up and grabbing that engagement and attention with the audience. And the second part of this is this isn't going to be solved by digital. Yes, okay, eSports is a very, very digital-based phenomenon. There's no doubt about that. You can't play football digitally, okay, or rugby digitally, unless you consider FIFA to be the equivalent of that, which I don't think it really counts as. So the reality is that what we're dealing with here is something which needs a bit of a balance between physical and digital. Some people may never come off digital, but the potential ultimately lies in the infrastructure which will come from physical locations. So what does this ultimately say about our professional teams and the top of the structure we're dealing with? What are the pillars that are holding it up? And understanding this is quite important. And the reason why I believe this is really important is because there's a lot of talk about the ownership of audience, or ownership of viewership, or we command this number of fans, or whatever the case may be. And the reality is that they may or may not be actually necessarily specifically interested in you, and you may not have control over that particular piece as an investor investing in some of these groups. Unlike other entertainment entities, there is no pillar from schools at this moment in time. That may change, but the reality is that that's an area of potential, but is non-existent at this moment in time. Club structure, it is starting to emerge sort of, okay, online, and it's very slowly starting to emerge physically in the West as well. But that's something which is another area which is a little bit rocky at this moment in time. Universities is a very interesting area because there is an infrastructure there, a very good infrastructure there, and it's starting to flourish as a pillar underneath all of this. But ultimately, from a professional perspective, a lot of players, or so-called pro players, have started to burn out by that period of time, allegedly. The winner of the Fortnite World Cup was 15-16. So there's an aspect here of, whilst this may well be a pillar of the community, it may not be where the professional teams are going to get their players from, their pro players and potentially their support. In a closed system, would you have provinces? At the moment, there is no view of that. The franchise system is sort of talking about it, but it's kind of city-based, and it's a little bit based upon whoever's just happened to buy that particular franchise. And then there's the question around digital platforms. How are these digital platforms flowing into the system? On a very basic level, if you think about it, how are professional teams going to replenish their professional players? You have a large number of people who are essentially first-generation pro players who are getting better and better and better and better and better and better from the rest of those who are playing computer games in this particular area or that particular e-sport. Once they retire, what happens next? Where is this going to come from? So the point with this is that when it comes down to it, it's not immediately clear that those at the top are necessarily building those foundations downwards. However, if you are able to build those pillars yourself as an investor or a particular partner or entity, you can own that audience. And that puts you in an extraordinarily powerful position. And that means that you can have those type of conversations with publishers. It means you can also have those conversations with brands. And it also means that you are able to fix the system to a certain extent to be to your benefit as much as it is to others within it. It also has a bit of puts an observation, a question mark over the franchise system itself in its entirety. So franchise, I have nothing against franchising because franchising is an extraordinarily sensible and clever move to do in a mature system where you are ultimately building up your brands and your teams based upon already established infrastructure. It's a very good way of incrementally growing your business. But if we look at this, NFL, for instance, their participation rate is very, very poor. There's only 1 million kids who play American football in high schools. That is your base building block. To put that into context, 3 million people in this country alone play rugby. And yet the Super Bowl is much bigger. That's based on the fact that NFL have basically sat themselves on top of somebody else's ecosystem, which goes from high schools to universities and then up to the NFL. There are no real clubs in that particular system. That's fine and it works very well, but ultimately if there's any sudden change, you have a problem. For instance, there is no real investment in the women's game in the NFL. It's just non-existent. That may become a problem over the next few years, especially as this becomes something of a hot topic around promoting women in sport. Why this is important, why I'm making this contrast, is that ultimately, generally, there are, in that particular mature system, is based upon a very, very solid base, which might have fundamental shifts which it may have problems with, but is based on a solidish base. Esports is very much in flux at this moment in time. Esports can come and go at the drop of a hat. Anyone who can remember Heroes of the Storm disappearing overnight will attest to this. Equally, it puts a big question mark over groups like Overwatch. Yes, it's very secure for right now, but what happens when it comes to the negotiations with Twitch and other groups? That may disappear overnight. What you're essentially doing with this is you're increasing the risk for immediate certainty. You're making your future very, very odd and very, 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 very shaky. It's subject to sudden shifts rather than constantly changing and being able to put sticky tape over it to keep it going, if that may be. So I think that, so bringing this to a bit of a wrap here, I think that this is, this whole system is very much still in flux at the moment, and it might be very bad for franchising. However, with all this, you do end up with a situation where there's a lot of opportunity for those who can get involved in building this particular piece. And those who can own physical assets right now, who can service physical assets, so your brands or your businesses which are facilitating internet providers, architects to build certain things, even people doing financial services at particular esports bars, those who are making merchandise, those who are selling beer at these places. This is an entry for you because you can facilitate the experience that people want without having to be as sexy as some of the professional teams out there. So infrastructure is the way forward with this, I believe. And for those who may think this is a bit of a sobering experience, and that ultimately I'm anti-esports, I'm actually very much an optimist in all of this. I believe that there is very little competition at the moment in this grassroots area. There's a hell of a lot of money you can get from it, and you can go direct to customer with it, if you are willing to invest. But ultimately, at this moment in time, the areas of greatest opportunity in esports may not be in the areas which people are shouting about the most. So, with that, questions? Oh, brilliant.
Hi. I realized that you put universities up there as a founding pillar for building up on the grassroots of esports. Can you tell me at the moment what your thoughts are on getting people to not only study at university but to compete in an esports team created by the university structure? And then how would they build a community structure that can then translate into bigger esports teams that can potentially get sponsored players and so on?
Yep. So the first part of your question, so how could it work? Well, it's already starting to happen already. NSC in this country is an obvious example of that. What you're seeing at this moment in time is physical locations being made in universities around that, and sports scholarships are coming out of it. There is a universities league. There's a hell of a lot of this stuff going on. That community is actually a very positive thing, and it's a very attractive area as well, because the vast number of people who are involved in esports, their degrees are STEM degrees, so they're high value individuals for work thereafter. So on the one hand, you have a group who are doing stuff which is very attractive to potential employers and the economy as a whole. On the second part, they're getting an opportunity they never would otherwise get, and they're far more likely to be pliant to what the university and teams want them to do, as opposed to some of the looser professional teams out there where you're, as a sponsor or some sort of partner, you're not entirely clear as whether that the individual is going to be wearing that sponsored kit, or they're going to be, putting a Red Bull can down as opposed to a Monster can, for instance. So there's a much greater, alliance and allegiance with the team, and also partly because they don't have that particular choice that some professional players do. So to answer that particular piece, the community around that place is actually doing very well and thriving. For those who want to be a supplier in that particular area, there's a fair bit of money to be made. Each university needs to spend at least $30,000 a year just to keep this thing going. So if you are able to provide the nuts and bolts to that, you're in a position where you can actually make a fair bit of money. And more groups are doing this, and from an international perspective, you're starting to see Pan-American championships, you're seeing European championships, you're starting to see world championships. This is a very good thing. How this works to the professional teams is that ultimately you have a physical location and a group of people who can funnel up into your team. Not dissimilar to what you see in American football to a certain extent, what you used to see with some sports like cricket and rugby, and that particular piece. So there's a large potential to start really scouting that particular piece and to help that, because you can start getting those sponsorship alignments well and truly up and ready for it. But the reality is that, how do I put this? There's a potential that a professional team may not be able to last the distance in a way that university will always be there. So Leicester University will not suddenly collapse in 5 years' time. However, there is a bit of a graveyard of professional teams that have come and gone in the last 2 years. So who needs whom here is the question, I'd say, with it, and that's an interesting point to consider.
Hi. Who you think should invest into this, and who should support each pillar of a professional journey creation? Should it be university, as you've mentioned, but what about schools and other parts of it? Because for me, it was pretty hard to convince whomever that this is not a social kind of development, which is very hard for a brand to believe in and to actually gain benefit from. Thanks.
Esports have a slight problem with they have a challenge in the fact that ultimately the IP is owned more or less completely by the publisher. With that foundation, it's very difficult to have an independent body such as the FA to do that on their behalf. And if I were a publisher, I'd be very reluctant to hand over any sort of influence at all, because ultimately, as a publisher, your business is to sell more games and to sell more in-game revenue and to push that along. So that's the initial challenge to this. So with that context, to answer your question, you have private firms, I think, are the way forward for some of the initial investment around the physical locations. Those who have assets will do very well out of this, and they could actually shortcut a lot of the teething problems. So there are a number of sports teams who are involved in this, and they believe that their brand is actually the important thing that comes to esports. I would disagree, because ultimately their brands may well sit very well in whatever sport that they may be in, the NBA, the NFL, soccer, whatever it may be. Yeah, but they do have stadiums, and they do have facilities, and they do have a local population, and they do have a reach. And that may not cross over in terms of the demographic, but the point that you have a load of great assets and things which we're starving for in some esports areas. Real estate being the obvious one. So I think that there are opportunities for those who have assets, such as land or like areas to do certain things in, so you don't have to build from scratch. I think certain institutions that have that already in the form of universities, possibly schools, etc., can look at dealing with some of the governing bodies which are kicking about, possibly, and government as part of all of that. But there is a big place for private firms, I think, in all of this. They have the stuff that isn't sexy, but ultimately facilitates what's going on. Discord is a good example in many ways of this. Discord, actually, if you look at what they're providing, isn't the sexiest of products at all. It's just it's a piece of software that ultimately allows people to talk to one another, and then some frills around the side of it. Yet it owns a large chunk of the community. And the reason why is because they actually decided to invest in it and make something much easier for the community to do. And that is something that a lot of businesses can think about, that they don't have to become an esports brand, entity, whatever the case may be. They can offer something to this industry by what they're specialist at.
Very much worth aware. Thanks.
No worries.
Hi. So I used to work for an esports team in Oceania. We've made Worlds, MSI, and we boot camped in Korea. And so my perception is that a PC bang in Korea plays a very different role to an internet cafe in the UK. What's your sense of that as a role and the potential opportunity for PC bangs in the UK?
So the nature of the PC bang, the internet cafe in the East in particular, has taken a long time to get to the cultural significance it is now with esports. So this isn't going to happen overnight in terms of providing a location. It's the Field of Dreams thing of build it and they will come. They might. But I think that if you're looking at it from a long-term perspective, I think that it's taken a while for what you have, ultimately a cultural phenomenon now in places like Korea. In the UK, Europe, and America, you're starting to see the emergence of these esports centres. Now, time will tell whether this will actually take on, but I think the reality is that as people become familiar with it and push that forward, you're going to see a lot more robustness in the system if it is able to take. Now, there's a debate between whether you have an esports centre which becomes a bar/club for everyone else, or whether you are looking at existing entities already, such as a sports team they're able to provide that facilities or whatever the case may be. But I think that when it comes down to it, I think that it's the best way. I'm trying to work out the best way of putting this without pissing people off. I think that you need to have that balance of physical and digital, and it will probably come from joining up in a partnership scenario. So those who already have those assets, and essentially familiarising people with it over a long period of time to 5 to 10 years. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Not really, but I think it's looking at I'd be really fascinated to look at to see more of the research, because it's really the social role that it plays, the PC bang plays in Korea, but also that a young kid in Korea has got no choice but to go to a PC bang or throw his grandmother out of their bedroom because he hasn't got anywhere to game at home.
Yep.
The other thing is, socially, as a Korean kid, you go to a PC bang with your mates and you play games together, whereas my son plays that from home because we've got 5 screens in our house, and I wouldn't class as being particularly wealthy. So he can play at home, and all his mates play at home. So the thought of going to an eSports cafe, and I've got friends in the UK who've tried to run eSports cafes and they've gone out of business because it's basically you're selling noodles, and it's really flipping hard. To run a hospitality business is pretty much, if I wanted to lose money on any business at all, I would run a cafe or a bar because it's just colossally expensive to set up, really hard to run. You've got enormous staff problems from the start. And you're working and playing with people who don't go out very much. Having worked with pro players for the last 2.5 years, they're not sociable creatures. So I'm not sure. There's stuff in your research that I think, you know what, like the grassroots area, we have got the idea that you can take a sport from someone's bedroom to playing on a global stage is just absolute nonsense. And so I, as performance director of teams, get all kinds of problems with players because they haven't had the development that someone from Chelsea Academy has had from the age of 10. So all that, absolutely crucial. But as you said, the publisher is the one with the money for that, and they own the whole thing. So, yeah, very difficult.
So I think just to put a very concise thought towards that, because I think that's an enormous topic which we could probably have a beer over a bit later and probably still not solve it. But I think that what you have interestingly at the moment is that in career it's around this fact that you can't get any peace or any of your own time as a teenager or a child without your family being there unless you go to a PC Bang. That's to a certain extent of where it's at. In the UK there are more options. However, I would say that those options are starting to shrink a little bit. And that's where it becomes an interesting piece. Can it become a place where kids hang out? That question is whether it is with, does it follow a cinema-like model, which could be profitable, or whether it follows a bar-like model, which may not well be profitable. It's a question mark over that. So there's less funding out there in general for any type of recreational stuff for children just in general, or young adults. I'm a member of a boxing club in one of the more deprived parts of London, and the council have fuck all interest in investing any money in there whatsoever, despite the fact it's helping a lot of kids from a disadvantaged background to do stuff. In fact, actually, London's a great example of where essentially there's been no investment in local government structures whatsoever. So you have kids who would be doing local clubs or local whatever the case may be, and they're just not anymore. There will be groups who are based online purely, and they always will be. Your son may be very happy just playing with his friends online and never be interested ever in going to an eSports centre, internet cafe, whatever the case may be. But I think it's definitely something which I think that that gap, I foresee there being a physical location there.
You know, and I can totally see why you would do that. It's just having been involved with Excel Esports for the last 12 months, I've got, I know how expensive it is to have a physical space and to have 4 houses full of players here, because we need them in one location rather than being virtual until you're absolutely being able to go, everyone going pro for a full-time career. But it's building grassroots, 100% certain we need to do it. I'm just really nervous about investing in physical assets to begin with. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that everyone wants to eat now and has got to the point of where we're eating into their lunchtime. So thank you all very, very much. If you want to talk to me, have a beer with me later. Cheers.